Honorable Evelyn Caldwell, a 78-year-old retired black judge, stepped into the first-class cabin of Flight 237, her elegant blonde wig perfectly in place. Little did she know, her journey was about to become a battlefield of prejudice and cruelty. When Mark, a self-important businessman used to getting his way, let his racist impulses take over, the entire cabin watched in stunned silence. What he did in that moment stripped away her dignity and exposed her vulnerability to everyone on board. But as shocked gasps filled the air and tensions reached a boiling point, no one could have predicted what would happen next. Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe. The bustling airport terminal hummed with activity on a bright, sunny afternoon. The cacophony of rolling luggage, intermittent announcements, and the excited chatter of travelers filled the air, creating a symphony of anticipation and movement. Amidst this controlled chaos stood Honorable Evelyn Caldwell, a 78-year-old retired black judge, her posture straight and dignified as she waited patiently in the check-in line. Evelyn's attire spoke volumes about her character. Elegant, yet practical for travel, her tasteful blonde wig, perfectly styled, sat atop her head like a crown, a silent testament to her ongoing battle. As she inched forward in the line, her mind wandered to the upcoming chemotherapy treatment that awaited her at her destination. She had chosen to keep her health struggles private, maintaining her usual air of dignity and strength. As she approached the check-in counter, Evelyn couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her here. Decades of breaking barriers in the legal profession, of facing prejudice with unwavering resolve, had prepared her for many things. But cancer? That was a foe she hadn't anticipated. Still, she faced it with the same quiet determination that had defined her career. The check-in process went smoothly, the airline staff treating her with the respect her first-class ticket commanded. As Evelyn collected her boarding pass, a familiar weariness settled into her bones. The treatments had taken their toll, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she squared her shoulders and made her way towards the security checkpoint. Just as she was about to join the security line, an announcement crackled over the PA system. "Attention passengers, we are now boarding first-class passengers for the shuttle bus to Flight 237. Please proceed to Gate 12. Evelyn adjusted her course, her rolling suitcase trailing obediently behind her. As she approached the gate, she couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would be different somehow. Little did she know just how prophetic that feeling would prove to be. As Evelyn approached the security checkpoint, her eyes were drawn to a commotion ahead. A man, probably in his early 60s, was making quite a scene. His expensive suit and flashy watch screamed of wealth, but his behavior spoke of something far less refined. This, Evelyn would soon learn, was Mark. Mark's voice carried across the security area, sharp and laden with irritation. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he snapped at a young TSA officer who had just asked him to remove his shoes. "This is ridiculous. I've been flying first class since before you were born." Evelyn watched silently, her expression neutral but her mind keenly observant. She had encountered men like Mark throughout her career, men who believed their wealth or status placed them above common courtesy or the law. As a judge, she had seen how such entitlement could corrupt a person's character. The TSA officer, to his credit, remained professional. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but this is standard procedure for all passengers. Please remove your shoes and place them in the bin." Mark complied, but not without muttering loudly about incompetent staff and wasting my valuable time. As he moved through the metal detector, Evelyn noticed several other passengers exchanging uncomfortable glances. It was then that Evelyn's turn came. She stepped forward, ready to go through the familiar routine. However, a different TSA officer approached her. "Ma'am, you've been randomly selected for additional screening. Please step this way." As Evelyn was led to a separate area, she heard Mark's voice again. This time, it was lower, but still audible to those nearby. "Oh, sure, randomly selected. More like profiling the wrong people. Maybe if they focused on real threats instead of little old ladies, we'd all be safer." The racial undertones in Mark's comment were clear, and Evelyn felt a familiar twinge in her chest. It was a feeling she knew all too well, the sting of prejudice, thinly veiled behind words like real threats. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had faced far worse in her lifetime. As she underwent the additional screening, Evelyn maintained her composure. She answered the officer's questions politely and cooperated fully, all while acutely aware of Mark's presence nearby. He continued to mutter and complain, throwing occasional glances her way. When the screening was finally complete, Evelyn gathered her belongings with practiced ease. As she turned to leave the security area, her eyes met Mark's for a brief moment. In that instant, she saw something that troubled her deeply, a mix of disdain and superiority that sent a chill down her spine. Shaking off the unsettling encounter, Evelyn made her way towards the VIP lounge. She had some time before boarding, and she hoped to find a moment of peace before the flight. Little did she know that her path would soon cross with Mark's again, setting in motion a chain of events that would test her resolve in ways she never expected. The VIP lounge was a stark contrast to the bustling terminal outside. Soft, ambient music played in the background, creating an atmosphere of exclusivity and calm. Well-dressed travelers sat in plush chairs, engrossed in their tablets or engaged in hushed conversations. Evelyn entered the lounge, her eyes taking in the familiar, luxurious surroundings. Despite her weariness, she felt a small sense of comfort in this haven of tranquility. Making her way to the buffet, Evelyn surveyed the array of gourmet snacks and beverages. She carefully selected a few items, balancing a small plate of fruit and cheese in one hand while reaching for a glass of water with the other. As she turned to find a seat, she felt a sudden tremor in her hands, a side effect of her recent treatments that she had been struggling to control. In a heart-stopping moment, the plate slipped from her grasp. The crash of porcelain against the marble floor echoed through the quiet lounge, drawing every eye in the room. Fruit rolled across the floor, and cheese smeared against the pristine tiles. Evelyn stood frozen, her face flushing with embarrassment. The silence that followed was deafening. Some passengers looked on with pity, while others quickly averted their gaze, pretending not to notice the elderly woman's mishap. Evelyn felt every stare like a physical weight, her usual composure cracking under the pressure of the moment. Before she could recover, a familiar voice cut through the awkward silence. "Well, I guess some people just don't belong in places like this. Need help, Granny?" Mark's words, dripping with mockery, seemed to amplify the humiliation tenfold. Evelyn's eyes found Mark, standing near the bar with a smirk on his face. His salt and pepper hair and the lines around his eyes betrayed his age, but did nothing to soften the cruelty of his words. A few onlookers snickered at his cruel joke, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The sting of his words was compounded by the racial undertones, a reminder that even in such an exclusive setting, prejudice could rear its ugly head. Fighting to maintain her dignity, Evelyn slowly bent down to clean up the mess. Her joints protested the movement, a stark reminder of her age and current health struggles. As she gathered the scattered food, she could hear Mark's laughter fading as he walked away, clearly pleased with himself. In that moment, as she knelt on the floor surrounded by the evidence of her vulnerability, Evelyn felt a complex mix of emotions. Humiliation warred with anger, sadness with determination. She thought to herself, "What a cruel, miserable human being. I hope I never see him again." But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew that hope was likely in vain. The world had a way of bringing such challenges to her doorstep time and time again. A kind-faced attendant rushed over with a dustpan and brush, offering assistance. Evelyn accepted the help graciously, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Thank you, dear. These old hands aren't as reliable as they used to be," she said, attempting to lighten the mood. As she stood up, straightening her clothes and adjusting her wig, Evelyn took a deep breath. She had faced far worse in her lifetime: discrimination, threats, and attempts to undermine her authority. This incident, while humiliating, was just another test of her resilience. With her head held high, Evelyn made her way to a seat in the corner of the lounge. She sat down, her posture impeccable despite the emotional weight she carried. As she sipped her water, she observed the other passengers returning to their activities, the incident already fading from their minds. But for Evelyn, the encounter with Mark had left a lasting impression. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a random, unpleasant interaction. As she waited for the boarding call, she steeled herself for the journey ahead. unaware that her path would cross with Mark's again all too soon. The call for first-class passengers to board the shuttle bus came over the lounge's speaker system, prompting a flurry of movement as travelers gathered their belongings. Evelyn rose gracefully, smoothing her clothes and double-checking that her wig was securely in place. The embarrassment from earlier still lingered, but she was determined to move past it and focus on her journey. As she exited the lounge and made her way to the shuttle boarding area, Evelyn's heart sank. There at the front of the small queue stood Mark. He was engaged in an animated conversation on his phone, his voice unnecessarily loud and his gestures dramatic, as if to ensure everyone knew just how important he was. Evelyn took her place in line, hoping that perhaps Mark wouldn't notice her. But as the doors of the small airport shuttle bus opened, it became clear that their paths would cross once again. Mark, still on his phone, rudely pushed past the other passengers, including Evelyn, to be the first on board. "Yeah, I'm just getting on this stupid little bus now," he said into his phone, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Can you believe they make us go through this? I mean, what am I paying for if not to avoid this kind of nonsense?" Evelyn boarded the bus, her eyes scanning for an available seat. To her dismay, she found that most were already taken, with Mark occupying one of the coveted front seats. As more passengers filed in, it became apparent that there weren't enough seats for everyone. An older woman with a cane noticed Evelyn standing and turned to Mark. "Excuse me, sir," she said politely. "Would you mind giving up your seat for this lady? She seems to be having trouble standing." Mark's response was immediate and harsh. "I paid for this seat like everyone else," he snapped, not even bothering to look up from his phone. "If she wanted to sit, she should have gotten here earlier." The woman who had spoken up looked shocked, while other passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Evelyn, however, remained composed. She had faced far worse discrimination in her life, and she wasn't about to let this man's rudeness break her spirit. As the bus began to move, Evelyn gripped the handrail tightly. The motion of the vehicle made it difficult to maintain her balance, and she could feel the strain in her arms and legs. Yet she stood tall, her face a mask of calm dignity. The short journey to the plane felt excruciatingly long. The air in the bus was thick with tension, broken only by Mark's continued loud phone conversation and the occasional murmur of discontent from other passengers. Evelyn could feel eyes on her, some filled with sympathy, others with a mix of guilt and helplessness. Throughout the ride, Evelyn's mind wandered to her years on the bench. She had presided over countless cases where people's true characters were revealed in moments of stress or conflict. This situation, she realized, was not so different. Mark's behavior was a reflection of a deeper issue, a sense of entitlement and a lack of empathy that she had seen destroy lives and communities. As the bus finally came to a stop at the plane, Evelyn felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had survived this small ordeal, but something told her that the real challenge was yet to come. As the passengers began to file out, Mark pushed his way to the front once again, nearly knocking Evelyn off balance in his haste. Stepping off the bus, Evelyn took a moment to compose herself. She straightened her back, adjusted her wig, and took a deep breath of the crisp airport air. Whatever lay ahead on this flight, she would face it with the same grace and strength that had carried her through a lifetime of breaking barriers and facing adversity. As she approached the plane's steps, Evelyn couldn't help but wonder what the next few hours would bring. Little did she know that her encounter with Mark was far from over, and that her resilience would be tested in ways she could never have imagined. As Evelyn boarded the plane, the familiar scent of recycled air and leather seats greeted her. The first-class cabin was a picture of luxury, with spacious seats and attentive flight attendants bustling about. Evelyn made her way down the aisle, her eyes scanning for her assigned seat. Finding her window seat, Evelyn began the process of settling in. She carefully stowed her small carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, her movements deliberate and measured to avoid any mishaps like the one in the lounge. As she eased herself into the plush seat, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. Here at least she had her own space, away from the judgmental eyes and cruel comments she had endured thus far. However, her moment of peace was short-lived. Just as she was fastening her seatbelt, a commotion from the aisle caught her attention. To her dismay, she saw Mark entering the first-class cabin, his face flushed with self-importance as he looked for his seat. Evelyn's heart sank as she realized that Mark was heading towards the row directly behind her. He struggled to fit his oversized carry-on into the overhead bin, muttering curses under his breath. Finally, with the help of an exasperated flight attendant, he managed to stow his luggage and took his seat. No sooner had Mark sat down than he began loudly complaining to his seatmate, a businesslike woman who seemed more interested in her laptop than Mark's conversation. "Can you believe the service these days?" Mark's voice carried easily in the quiet cabin. "Standards are really slipping. I remember when flying first class meant something." Though Mark didn't explicitly mention race, the implication in his words was clear to Evelyn. She sat rigidly in her seat, her back straight, trying to ignore the thinly veiled comments clearly aimed at her presence in the first-class cabin. A young flight attendant named Sarah approached, her smile faltering slightly as she sensed the tension emanating from Mark's seat. "Can I get you anything to drink before takeoff, sir?" she asked politely. Mark scoffed. "Finally, some service. I'll have a scotch, neat, and make it quick, will you? Some of us have important things to do." Sarah nodded, her professional demeanor never slipping, despite Mark's rudeness. As she turned to leave, her eyes met Evelyn's. There was a flicker of concern in the young woman's gaze, a silent question of whether everything was all right. Evelyn gave her a small, reassuring smile. She had dealt with men like Mark her entire career. She wouldn't let him ruin her flight. As the plane began its taxi to the runway, Evelyn tried to focus on the view outside her window. She watched the ground crew scurry about, the other planes lining up for takeoff, anything to distract her from the unpleasant presence behind her. But Mark's voice continued to intrude on her thoughts. "You know," he said loudly to his seatmate, who was clearly trying to work, "I've been flying first class for decades. Never used to see certain types up here. Guess they're just letting anyone in these days." Evelyn's hands tightened on the armrests, her knuckles turning white with the effort of maintaining her composure. She had faced prejudice throughout her life and career, but there was something particularly galling about being trapped in this small space with such blatant bigotry. As the plane lifted off the ground, Evelyn closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about the challenges she had overcome in her life. Being one of the few black women in law school, facing discrimination in the courtroom, and now battling cancer. This, she reminded herself, was just another test of her resilience. She opened her eyes, gazing out at the clouds as they climbed higher into the sky. In her mind, she began to formulate strategies for dealing with Mark's behavior, drawing on her years of experience handling difficult people in the courtroom. She would not let this man's ignorance and cruelty defeat her. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, Evelyn allowed herself a small sigh of relief. At least now she could get up and walk around if Mark's comments became too much to bear. But she also knew that movement might draw his attention, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for a direct confrontation. The flight settled into a rhythm, with the hum of the engines providing a constant backdrop to the murmur of conversations and the occasional ding of a call button. Evelyn tried to lose herself in a book she had brought, but found her concentration repeatedly broken by Mark's loud voice behind her. About 2 hours into the flight, Evelyn felt a sudden jolt. At first, she thought it was turbulence, but then she felt something cold and wet seeping into the fabric of her sleeve. Turning slightly, she saw Mark's hand retreating, a now empty glass in his grasp. "Oh, clumsy me," Mark said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Looks like I've had a little accident." Evelyn took a deep breath, steeling herself before responding. With quiet dignity, she turned to face Mark and said, "Sir, please be more careful. Your drink has spilled onto my armrest and my sleeve." Mark's eyes narrowed, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He leaned in close, his voice low but clear enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Listen here, you old snake," he began, using a racial slur that made Evelyn's blood run cold. The slur hung in the air like a noxious cloud. Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending not to have heard, others exchanging worried glances. The atmosphere in the cabin, already tense, now felt electric with unspoken outrage and shame. Evelyn sat perfectly still, her face a mask of composure even as her heart raced. In her years on the bench, she had heard that word many times, each instance a reminder of the long road to equality that still stretched out before society. But to hear it here, in this confined space thousands of feet above the earth, felt particularly jarring. Sarah, the flight attendant who had noticed the earlier tension, approached cautiously. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her eyes darting between Evelyn and Mark. Before Evelyn could respond, Mark waved Sarah away. "Everything's fine. Just a little spill. Nothing to worry about." Sarah hesitated, clearly sensing that there was more to the situation than a simple accident. She turned to Evelyn. "Ma'am, can I get you anything? Perhaps a cloth to dry your sleeve?" Evelyn managed a small smile. "Thank you, dear. That would be very kind." As Sarah hurried away to fetch a cloth, Evelyn could feel Mark's eyes boring into the back of her head. The slur he had used echoed in her mind, bringing back memories of past hurts and injustices. But along with the pain came a familiar resolve. She had faced down bigots in the courtroom, in the streets, and in the highest echelons of power. She would not be cowed by this man. When Sarah returned with the cloth, Evelyn thanked her graciously. As she dabbed at her damp sleeve, she could hear Mark muttering behind her, his words just low enough to be indistinct, but his tone unmistakably hostile. The other passengers in the immediate vicinity were visibly uncomfortable. Some buried their heads deeper in their books or tablets, while others cast furtive glances at Evelyn and Mark, unsure of how to react or if they should intervene. Evelyn finished cleaning her sleeve as best she could and settled back into her seat. She tried to return to her book, but the words swam before her eyes, refusing to come into focus. Her mind was racing, replaying the incident and considering her options. She could confront Mark directly, but that might escalate the situation further. She could report him to the flight crew, but that might lead to an even more uncomfortable remainder of the flight. Or she could do what she had done countless times before: endure with dignity and seek justice through proper channels when the time was right. As she weighed her options, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation was far from over. Mark's hostility seemed to be growing with each passing minute, and the confined space of the airplane left little room for escape or diffusion. Looking out the window at the vast sky, Evelyn sent up a silent prayer for strength and wisdom. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage and grace that had carried her through a lifetime of breaking barriers and facing adversity. Little did she know that the worst was yet to come, and that her resilience would soon be tested in a way she could never have imagined. The tension in the first-class cabin had reached a fever pitch. The other passengers, while outwardly focused on their own activities, were acutely aware of the simmering hostility between Evelyn and Mark. The air felt thick with unspoken words and barely contained anger. Evelyn sat rigidly in her seat, her book long forgotten in her lap. She could feel Mark's presence behind her like a physical weight, his occasional mutters and huffs a constant reminder of the threat he posed. Despite her years of experience dealing with difficult people, she found herself on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It happened suddenly, without warning. Frustrated by Evelyn's continued composure in the face of his provocations, Mark finally snapped. In a swift, brutal motion, he reached forward and yanked Evelyn's wig off her head, revealing her bald scalp to the entire cabin. "No more pretending," Mark sneered, tossing the wig into the aisle. The cabin fell into a shocked silence. Time seemed to stand still as the reality of what had just occurred sank in. Evelyn sat frozen, her hands instinctively moving to cover her exposed head. The shame and vulnerability she felt in that moment was overwhelming, threatening to break the composure she had maintained for so long. Passengers around them gasped, some half rising from their seats in muted outrage. But no one moved to intervene immediately, the shock of the moment paralyzing them into inaction. Sarah, the flight attendant who had been keeping a watchful eye on the situation, rushed forward. Her face was a mix of horror and concern as she knelt beside Evelyn's seat. "Ma'am, are you all right?" she asked softly, her hand hovering uncertainly, unsure how to offer comfort in such a situation. Evelyn couldn't speak. The tears she had been holding back threatened to spill over. She had faced discrimination and cruelty throughout her life, but this public humiliation struck at the very core of her being. Her wig wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a shield, a way to maintain her dignity in the face of a devastating illness. And now that shield had been ripped away in the cruelest manner possible. Mark, seemingly emboldened by the shocked silence around him, continued his tirade. "See? This is what I'm talking about. People pretending to be something they're not. It's time someone called it out. His words hung in the air, dripping with malice and ignorance. A few passengers muttered in disgust, but still no one directly confronted Mark. The unspoken rules of polite society seemed to have paralyzed everyone, leaving them uncertain how to react to such a blatant act of cruelty. Another flight attendant joined Sarah, picking up the wig from the aisle. He handed it to Evelyn with a look of deep sympathy. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he said quietly. "Is there anything we can do?" Evelyn's hands shook as she took the wig. She wanted to put it back on, to reclaim some semblance of control over the situation. But she also felt a deep sense of shame at having to do so in front of all these strangers. It was a moment of vulnerability she had never wanted to experience, especially not like this. As she struggled to replace the wig with trembling hands, Evelyn could hear Mark behind her, his voice loud and smug. "Just having some fun," he proclaimed to no one in particular. "Can't anyone take a joke these days?" The callousness of his words seemed to finally break the spell of inaction that had fallen over the cabin. Murmurs of disapproval grew louder, and several passengers turned in their seats to glare at Mark. But still, no one directly confronted him or came to Evelyn's defense. Evelyn, with the help of Sarah, finally managed to secure her wig back in place, but the damage had been done. She felt exposed, violated in a way she had never experienced before. The privacy of her illness, the dignity she had fought so hard to maintain, had been stripped away in an instant of cruel prejudice. As she sat there, trying to regain her composure, Evelyn's mind raced. She thought of all of the battles she had fought in her life, in the courtroom, in society, and now against cancer. This, she realized, was perhaps her greatest test yet. How she responded in this moment would define not just this flight, but perhaps her entire approach to facing adversity. With a deep breath, Evelyn straightened her back and raised her chin. She may have been knocked down, but she was far from defeated. As she looked around the cabin, meeting the sympathetic and ashamed gazes of her fellow passengers, she knew that the next move was hers to make. The question now was, how would she respond to this ultimate act of disrespect and cruelty? The answer to that question would shape the remainder of the flight and potentially impact the lives of everyone involved in ways they couldn't yet imagine. In the wake of Mark's shocking act, the first-class cabin was a cauldron of emotions. The initial stunned silence gave way to a rising tide of murmurs, gasps, and expressions of disbelief. Passengers exchanged glances of horror and outrage, their faces a mix of shock, sympathy, and shame. A middle-aged woman, 2 rows ahead, half rose from her seat, her face contorted with anger. "How dare you?" she hissed at Mark, but her voice lacked the conviction to carry across the cabin. She sank back down, her face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment at her own tepid response. An elderly gentleman across the aisle cleared his throat loudly, shooting Mark a disapproving glare. "Sir," he began, his voice quavering slightly, "that was entirely uncalled for." But when Mark met his gaze with a challenging smirk, the old man faltered, averting his eyes and retreating into uncomfortable silence. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Everyone seemed to be waiting for someone else to take the lead, to be the first to confront Mark directly. But the unspoken rules of public behavior, the fear of escalating the situation, kept them rooted in their seats. Sarah, the flight attendant, who had been helping Evelyn, stood up slowly. Her face was a mask of professional calm, but her eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. She turned to her colleague, speaking in a hushed but urgent tone. "We need to report this to the captain. This is assault, isn't it?" Her colleague nodded grimly. "I'll go inform him now. But what do we do about—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely towards Mark. Sarah bit her lip, clearly torn between her duty to maintain order and her desire to comfort Evelyn. I don't know. We can't move him to another seat. The flight's full. And we can't exactly restrain him unless he becomes physically violent." As the flight attendants debated their options, Evelyn's voice cut through the tense atmosphere. "Excuse me," she said, her tone calm but firm. "I'd like to make a phone call, please. It's rather urgent." Sarah turned to Evelyn, relief evident on her face at having a task to focus on. "Of course, ma'am, but I should warn you, satellite calls from the plane are quite expensive." A small, determined smile played on Evelyn's lips. No need to worry about that. Please put it on my credit card. This call is necessary. Sarah nodded, quickly fetching the satellite phone. As she handed it to Evelyn, the older woman stood up, her movements deliberate and controlled. Without a glance at Mark or the other passengers, she made her way to a quiet corner of the cabin. As Evelyn began her call, speaking in low, measured tones, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing the plane's descent. The other passengers, still reeling from the incident, began to prepare for landing, all while casting curious glances at Evelyn. Mark, who had been smirking earlier, now looked increasingly uncomfortable. The smug satisfaction that had fueled his actions was fading, replaced by a growing sense of unease as he watched Evelyn's calm demeanor during her phone call. As the plane began its descent, Evelyn finished her call and returned to her seat. Her face betrayed no emotion, but there was a glint of determination in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The rest of the descent passed in relative quiet, the usual chatter of passengers preparing to land replaced by a tense silence. Everyone seemed to be waiting, watching, wondering what would happen next. As the plane entered its final approach, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, instructing passengers to prepare for landing. The normalcy of these instructions stood in stark contrast to the extraordinary events that had unfolded earlier. Evelyn sat calmly in her seat, her posture relaxed but alert. The quiet confidence she exuded seemed to unnerve Mark, who kept shooting worried looks in her direction. The smug bravado he had displayed earlier had all but evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy that had him fidgeting in his seat. As the plane touched down with a gentle bump, a collective sigh of relief could be heard throughout the cabin. However, instead of taxiing directly to the gate, the plane came to a stop on the tarmac. After a few moments of confusion, the captain's voice came over the intercom once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I apologize for the inconvenience, but we're experiencing a slight delay in reaching our gate. Due to backed-up traffic from earlier delayed flights, our assigned gate is currently occupied. We've been assured that it should clear up within the next 15 to 20 minutes. We ask for your patience during this time. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we've reached the gate and the fasten seatbelt sign has been turned off." A murmur of frustration rippled through the cabin. Passengers who had been eager to disembark and put the tense flight behind them now found themselves forced to wait even longer. Sarah, the flight attendant, approached Evelyn's seat and leaned down to speak to her quietly. "Ma'am, is there anything you need while we wait? Can I get you some water or anything else?" Evelyn smiled up at her. "No, thank you, dear. You've been very kind throughout this ordeal. I'm quite all right waiting a bit longer." As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly restless. Passengers checked their watches, scrolled through their phones, or engaged in hushed conversations. Mark's nervousness seemed to increase with each passing moment. He kept glancing towards the exit, as if contemplating making a run for it as soon as the doors opened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was actually just over 20 minutes, the plane began to move again. As they approached the gate, the captain made another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're now approaching our gate. We apologize again for the delay and thank you for your patience. Local time is 5:10 p.m., and the temperature is a pleasant 72 degrees. Please remain seated until we've come to a complete stop and the fasten seatbelt sign has been turned off." The relief in the cabin was palpable as the plane finally docked at the gate. Passengers began to stir, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. However, before the seatbelt sign could be turned off, another announcement came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your continued patience. We've been instructed to hold all passengers on board for a few more moments. We'll begin deplaning as soon as we receive clearance. Thank you for your understanding." This announcement was met with confused murmurs and concerned glances. Evelyn remained calm, her eyes focused straight ahead. Mark, on the other hand, was visibly agitated. "This is ridiculous," he announced to no one in particular, his voice tinged with panic. "I have important business to attend to. They can't keep us here like this." Little did Mark know, his actions during the flight were about to catch up with him in a way he never anticipated. As the passengers waited in tense silence, events were unfolding just beyond the cabin door that would bring this dramatic flight to its final, justice-serving conclusion. As the passengers waited restlessly in their seats, the cabin door finally opened. However, instead of the usual ground crew, two uniformed police officers stepped into the first-class cabin. Their presence immediately silenced all conversation, and a hush fell over the entire section. The lead officer, a stern-faced man with graying hair, spoke in a clear, authoritative voice. "Good evening, everyone. We apologize for the further delay. We're here in response to a reported incident that occurred during this flight. We need to speak with Mr. Mark Johnson. Sir, could you please identify yourself?" All eyes turned to Mark, who had shrunk back in his seat. The color drained from his face as he realized the gravity of the situation. "What? You can't be serious," he sputtered, his voice a mix of indignation and fear. "This is ridiculous. I haven't done anything wrong." The second officer stepped forward, his voice firm but calm. "Mr. Johnson, we need you to come with us. We have some questions regarding your behavior during this flight." Mark stood up abruptly, looking around wildly as if seeking support from his fellow passengers. Finding none, he turned to Evelyn, his voice now tinged with desperation. "You? You did this, didn't you? Who do you think you are? You can't do this to me." Evelyn, who had remained seated and calm throughout this process, finally turned to face Mark. Her voice was steady and clear as she spoke. "I am Honorable Evelyn Caldwell, retired federal judge. And yes, I did make a call, not for revenge, Mr. Johnson, but for justice. Your actions today were not just cruel, they were criminal. And in this country, we have laws against such behavior." A collective gasp went through the cabin. Passengers looked at Evelyn with newfound respect and admiration. The revelation of her identity seemed to cast her quiet dignity throughout the flight in a new light. Mark, realizing the seriousness of his situation, began to panic. "Wait, please, I didn't know. It was just a joke. You can't do this to me. Do you know who I am? I have connections, important business deals. This will ruin me." The lead officer gently but firmly took Mark's arm. "Sir, please come with us. You'll have a chance to explain your side of the story at the station." As Mark was led off the plane, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated, replaced by pleading and fear. "Please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean any harm. Judge Caldwell, please, can't we talk about this? I'll apologize. I'll do anything." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. As he disappeared from view, escorted by the officers, a spontaneous applause broke out in the cabin. It started softly but quickly grew into a thunderous ovation directed at Evelyn. Evelyn, however, didn't revel in the moment. She simply nodded, acknowledging the support of her fellow passengers with grace. As the applause died down, she stood slowly, gathering her belongings. Sarah approached her once again, this time with tears in her eyes. "Judge Caldwell, we can't apologize enough for what happened today. Is there anything we can do for you?" Evelyn patted Sarah's hand gently. "You did your best in a difficult situation, my dear. What's important now is that we learn from this. Injustice thrives when good people stay silent. Remember that." With those words, Evelyn made her way off the plane, leaving behind a cabin full of people profoundly affected by what they had witnessed. As she stepped into the jet bridge, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day's events. But there was also a sense of accomplishment. Once again, she had faced injustice head-on and emerged victorious. Instead of heading directly to the terminal, Evelyn approached the officers who were escorting Mark. "Officers," she said, her voice firm and resolute, "I'd like to accompany you to give a full statement. It's crucial that Mr. Johnson faces the appropriate consequences for his actions today." The lead officer nodded respectfully. "Of course, Judge Caldwell, your statement will be invaluable in ensuring justice is served." As she followed the officers, Evelyn couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. Here she was, on her way to cancer therapy, once again serving justice. Not from behind the bench in a courtroom, but as a victim and witness to a deplorable act of discrimination. While walking towards the airport police station, Evelyn thought about all the young women she had mentored over the years, all the people who looked to her as a symbol of strength and perseverance. She hoped that her actions today would serve as yet another lesson in courage and dignity in the face of adversity. The day's events had been a harsh reminder that prejudice and cruelty still existed in the world. but they had also been a powerful demonstration of the strength that comes from standing up for what's right, no matter the personal cost or circumstances.